union scale is not going to cut it. But he decides that he's going to get a free Cadillac by basically taking home one piece at a time. He's just going to sneak something out every day in his lunchbox, and at the end of his career there in the Cadillac assembly line, he retires and decides that he is going to put together all of the pieces, and the pieces didn't really fit together, and so he ends up with his car that's got two headlights on one side and one on the other, and it was free. It didn't cost him a dime, but it's not exactly what he thought he was going to get at the end of that process, and that definitely is something that can happen with outsourcing if you don't deal with the mapping, integrating, and standardizing tasks that will face you. You have to have approaches that mesh. So related upstream, downstream processes, any place there's a handoff or touch point, you have to look at how is that going to work. As an example, when the software is to be delivered from the development organization to the test team for system testing, how is that going to work? And I mean in detail. You can't, yeah, these guys, they'll let us know when it's ready. That will not suffice. You're going to have to think about this stuff, because I have seen fairly serious crises break out when these sorts of handoffs were not properly defined, and then you went to try to execute it, and it turned out to be a lot more complicated than people thought, and things that, had they been done up front off the critical path, suddenly get on the critical path and cause significant delays in the testing. So, think about this stuff. Now, you could standardize glossaries for terminology, look at your processes, look at your templates, tools, information, and so forth. All of this stuff, the more aligned and congruent and consistent you can get the approach in the different organizations, the better. But it's also possible to go overboard here. So, you want to think about what's the simplest thing we could do to deal with this difference in approach. Could we perhaps solve 80% of the challenges associated with the differences in approach rather simply, and then leave the other ones to deal with themselves when they come up? Or are we going to get to the point where we're going to expend more effort trying to deal with this challenge, trying to make this challenge go away, than we would if we just lived with it during the project? So do think about that. Remember, the reason to standardize these approaches is not to have standardized approaches, but to support an effective and efficient process and project. Okay, so lifecycle implications. Whatever you're doing, waterfall, V-model, Agile, Scrum, XP, RUP, whatever you're going to do, you need to make sure that the life cycle, either inherently or through additional effort on your part, is adapted to allow for the distribution of work, the effective distribution of work, and the efficient distribution of work. If it's going to create more work to figure out how to distribute the work than the work that's being distributed is, then obviously you're not getting anything out of this. Now, you also want to make sure that there are checkpoints and course correction opportunities at regular, predictable, and reasonable intervals. And this, obviously you don't want to do this too frequently. Those of you who have children may have been familiar with the refrain from the back seat, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" That's not something you want to do, because then you're going to be pestering people and you're introducing additional inefficiencies and frustrations into the process. But at the same time, if you don't check frequently enough, little mistakes that could easily have been resolved, easily and cheaply been resolved had it been discovered quickly, will fester into enormous problems. And by the time you discover them, the impact will be and can be very significant, and we've seen that happen with clients. So you certainly want to try to think about, well, how frequently do we want to have conference calls or virtual team meetings or something like that that allows us to have these checkpoints and make sure that we're doing the right things. Now, that has to be balanced against this third point here, the reducing of the complexity in handoffs, touch points, communications, change management, all those things. You want to make sure that you don't create some kind of overly complex process for doing checkpoints and course correction, or for any of these other coordinative activities that are going to need to happen between the client and the outsourcing organization. If you make this stuff overly complicated, you put too much overhead on it, then it's going to get less and less efficient. I think an example of that, we recently had an engagement where we were being asked to do something that was fairly high-level type of consulting, and the client insisted on tracking tasks broken down to almost like a 1 to 2 hour chunk size, and then making sure that we didn't go over on the estimated time of the tasks. And this would have been perfectly appropriate for tracking people executing a predefined set of test cases, but what we were doing was more open-ended than that. And we ended up getting in a situation where there was almost as much time spent trying to keep that tracking up to date as our needs evolved, and trying to renegotiate, rediscuss how much time was required for something as the engagement itself took. So you want to organize this stuff, but you don't want to so burden this thing, the relationship with bureaucracy, that it gets unmanageable. Okay, now let's take a look at life cycle models and how they might affect us carving up the work as part of this coordinative role. I'm going to use the V model just because it's an easier picture to draw. The same kinds of ideas would apply in Agile. Same kind of analysis would have to be done, but we'll use the V model here, sequential model, and I'm assuming that all of you are familiar with the V model, so I'm not going to go through and explain how that works. So if you look at this, the capture of requirements and the development of acceptance tests are things that you could, and I would recommend should, retain in-house. I mean, obviously you're going to have to hand requirements off to an outsourced development team if you're going to outsource the development, and those requirements need to be reasonably well specified. You know, just saying, well, you know, the classic example, I want a boat. You know, just build me a boat. That's anything. You can get back anything from a rowboat to a you know, the Queen Mary with that kind of requirement. You're going to need to give people more detail than that. And so you're going to keep that piece in-house. Now, the design of the system is then going to be done by the outsourced development organization. Let's assume we're outsourcing the development. And let's assume that you've picked a separate organization to do the testing of what these people develop. And I'll get back into why I think that's a good idea a little bit later. So an outsourced test organization is going to, using the design and the requirements, create the integration and system tests. So that work is getting carved up. Now, outsourced development organization implements the system based on the design, and the outsourced development organization develops the component or unit tests to be run, depending on the name you prefer, and they execute those unit tests. And of course, this is happening you know, in real time. There's actually, at the base of the V, more of a cycle that's happening here, right? It's you know, we're iterating around, and indeed this part of the process might very well be following Agile lifecycle and still be overall project following a V. Now, once that is done, to some extent, we can start getting the integration testing going with the outsourced test organization. And I'm leaving out the feedback loop here from this picture, but of course you would need to have a feedback loop going back and forth, between these organizations where there are bugs and new releases being handed off, and this is one of those touch point logistic kind of issues that I talked about. And once the outsourced test organization has given you the green light and hopefully found all of the defects that need to be found, they hand off to acceptance, hand it back to you for in-house acceptance test. And if this process has gone well,